She protected her 7 grandchildren from everything, but what she sacrificed was never told. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The cracked linoleum beneath Margaret's swollen feet told stories of countless mornings like this one. Her weathered hands gripped the edge of the kitchen sink as she stared out the window of her Chicago tenement, watching 7 small figures trudge through the October frost toward Benjamin Franklin Elementary. Each child clutched a paper bag lunch she'd assembled from whatever remained in their nearly empty pantry, 2 slices of day-old bread, a bruised apple split between the youngest ones, and a prayer that it would be enough until dinner. The neighbors whispered behind yellowed curtains as they passed. "That old woman with all those kids," they'd mutter, shaking their heads in disapproval, acting like she's some kind of saint. But they never asked how those 7 souls had come to rest under her aching care, never wondered why a woman of 68 spent her days scrubbing strangers' floors and her nights mending clothes by lamplight. Margaret knew the truth they couldn't see. Each child carried the ghost of her own lost children. Tommy's defiant chin reminded her of his father, her eldest son, who disappeared into addiction's hungry mouth. Little Sarah had her mother's gentle eyes, the same eyes that had closed forever when Margaret's daughter was claimed by the factory fire that never made headlines. The other 5 belonged to her youngest, sweet Rebecca, who'd vanished into silence after marrying a man whose promises turned to bruises. When the social workers had come with their clipboards and official papers threatening to separate the children into different foster homes, Margaret had planted herself in the doorway, like an oak tree refusing to bend. Her voice, hoarse from years of holding back tears, had cut through their bureaucratic politeness. "You want them, you'll have to carry me out first." They'd looked at her crumbling porch, her patched roof, her defiant stance, and somehow decided to leave. They never returned. The smell of instant coffee and determination filled the cramped kitchen as Margaret prepared for another day of invisible labor. Mrs. Henderson from Oak Park needed her bathroom scrubbed. The Kowalski family required their laundry folded with military precision. And tonight, if her arthritic hands could manage it, she'd finish the alterations that earned her an extra $20, money that would stretch their grocery budget through the weekend. Her reflection in the toaster showed a face carved by sacrifice eyes that had seen too much loss, but still held fierce love for the 7 reasons she rose each morning. The wooden floorboards groaned under Margaret's feet as she moved through their 3-room apartment, straightening homework papers and folding blankets that served as both bedding and warmth. In the corner, 8-year-old Michael slept soundly, his small body curled around a stuffed rabbit she'd sewn from old sweater scraps. His breathing was steady now, but she remembered the nights when fever had racked his tiny frame, and she'd sat awake, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, because a doctor's visit meant choosing between medicine and meals. The morning ritual began as it always did, counting coins twice before deciding whether yesterday's bread would stretch another day. 47 cents lay scattered across the kitchen table, each penny representing a calculation between necessity and hope. The children never complained, never questioned why their breakfast was smaller than their classmates', never mentioned that their shoes had holes or their coats were too thin for Chicago's bitter winds. They trusted her completely, called her Grandma, Maggie, with voices full of the only unconditional love she had left in the world. Margaret's worn hands trembled slightly as she divided the last of the oatmeal into 7 equal portions, adding a sprinkle of cinnamon, a luxury she allowed herself once a week when the grocer marked down the spice containers. Each bowl represented a promise she'd made to herself. These children would know, love would feel valued, would believe in their own worth, even when the world seemed determined to prove them worthless. She stirred slowly, methodically, as if the repetitive motion could stir hope into their simple meal. The distant sound of the elevated train rumbled through their thin walls, carrying commuters to offices and opportunities that seemed as distant as the moon. Margaret had once dreamed of different sounds: the rustle of turning pages, the scratch of chalk on blackboard, the eager voices of students discovering new worlds through literature. But those dreams belonged to a woman who no longer existed. Buried beneath the weight of choices that had led her here to this moment, to these 7 precious souls who depended on her completely. Outside their window, the city awakened with the harsh symphony of urban survival, car horns blaring impatience, construction crews hammering progress into existence, and the distant wail of sirens racing towards someone else's emergency. Margaret closed her eyes and let the cacophony wash over her, finding strange comfort in the familiar chaos. This was their world, rough and unforgiving, but it was theirs. And somehow in this cramped apartment, filled with hand-me-down furniture and unconditional love, she was building something precious, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice sacrifice and a grandmother's fierce determination to protect what mattered most. As Margaret stood at the threshold between night's worries and day's challenges, her weathered reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman who had learned to carry mountains. The face looking back had been shaped by loss, deep lines around. Her eyes from tears both shed and swallowed silver hair that had turned white, not from age, but from the weight of responsibility. Yet something unbreakable lived in her gaze, a fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many storms had tried to drown it. The children began stirring in their makeshift bedrooms, separated by hanging sheets that provided the illusion of privacy in their crowded space. 13-year-old Jennifer, the eldest, automatically reached for the baby monitor she'd fashioned from 2 tin cans and string to listen for 4-year-old Emma's nightmares. At 14, Jennifer carried responsibilities that would crush most adults. Helping Margaret bathe the younger ones, assisting with homework she barely understood herself, and serving as translator between childhood fears and grandmother's wisdom. Margaret watched Jennifer move through their morning routine with efficiency born of necessity, her young face already showing signs of premature maturity. The girl deserved teenage concerns: boys' friendships, dreams of prom dresses and college applications. Instead, she folded clothes with the precision of someone who understood that survival demanded perfection in small things. Margaret's heart ached, knowing that Jennifer's childhood had been sacrificed on the altar of family preservation. Yet she felt profound pride watching her granddaughter's gentle competence with the younger children. The kitchen became a symphony of organized chaos as 7 children prepared for school with military efficiency. Backpacks were checked for completed homework, faces were scrubbed with washcloths that had seen better decades, and shoes were tied with laces that had been knotted and re-knotted to hide the fact that they'd grown too short. Margaret moved among them like a conductor, orchestrating hope, smoothing hair, wiping noses, and whispering encouragement into ears that had learned to listen for love in the spaces between words. But what haunted Margaret most was not what she had lost, but what she had chosen to abandon. Hidden beneath their mattress lay a manila envelope containing certificates and letters that belonged to a different woman, a teacher named Margaret Sullivan, who had once commanded respect in Lincoln High School's faculty lounge, who had guided hundreds of students toward college scholarships and better futures. The woman who had been offered the position of principal at Washington Academy, a prestigious school that would have doubled her salary and secured her retirement. The woman who had said no without explanation and walked away from 23 years of building something meaningful. Would the children ever understand the choice she'd made? Would they ever need to know who she had been before she became their salvation? Margaret turned toward the door, ready to face another day of scrubbing other people's dreams while nurturing her own 7 miracles, carrying the weight of her secret sacrifice like a stone in her chest. Margaret's days blurred into an endless cycle of other people's messes and her own quiet desperation. Her knees screamed protests as she knelt on marble floors in Lincoln Park mansions, scrubbing grime from baseboards while wealthy families complained about trivial inconveniences. Her employer, Mrs. Richardson, would hover nearby, pointing out missed spots with the casual cruelty of someone who had never wondered where her housekeeper slept or whether her children had eaten breakfast. "Margaret, you've missed the corner again," Mrs. Richardson would say, her manicured nails clicking against her coffee cup. "I'm paying for thoroughness, not speed." Margaret would nod silently, swallowing responses that tasted like bile, knowing that losing this job would mean choosing between keeping the lights on or keeping food in 7 growing bellies. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The bus ride home stretched her already thin budget, but Margaret's feet had begun betraying her, swelling so severely that walking the 5 miles became impossible. She'd sit in the back, surrounded by other invisible workers heading home to their own struggles, watching Chicago's glittering skyline through smudged windows. Those towers of glass and steel represented dreams that belonged to different people's lives, unburdened by the weight of 7 children who depended on every decision she made. Evening brought new challenges as Margaret transformed from cleaning lady to teacher, nurse, and referee. Kitchen table homework sessions became battlegrounds where fractions met frustration and grammar lessons collided with empty stomachs. 9-year-old David struggled with reading his dyslexia, making simple words dance like enemies on the page. Margaret would sit beside him for hours, her own exhaustion forgotten, as she helped him decode sentences that felt like insurmountable puzzles. "I'm stupid, Grandma Maggie," David would whisper, tears streaming down his cheeks. "The other kids read so fast and I can't even—" Margaret would pull him close, her heart breaking at the defeat in his voice. "You're not stupid, sweetheart. Your brain just works differently, like a special key that opens different doors. We'll find your doors together." She'd trace letters with her finger until he understood, celebrating each small victory like it was Olympic gold. The neighbors' whispers grew louder as the children grew older and their needs became more expensive. "She's in over her head," they'd mutter at the corner store, watching Margaret count food stamps with the careful precision of someone for whom every penny held weight. "Those kids need more than she can give them. Someone should call the authorities." Margaret would pretend not to hear, focusing on stretching ground beef into a week's worth of meals, while her face burned with shame and defiance in equal measure. But late at night, when 7 children slept peacefully in beds she'd assembled from donated parts and pure determination, Margaret would allow herself moments of crushing doubt. Had she been selfish to keep them? Could foster families have provided better food, warmer clothes, brighter futures? The questions would circle her exhausted mind, like vultures feeding on her deepest fears, until exhaustion finally claimed her consciousness. Yet morning always brought renewed purpose, as small arms wrapped around her neck and sleepy voices whispered, "Good morning, Grandma Maggie," with absolute trust in her ability to make everything right. These children hadn't chosen their circumstances, but they had chosen to love her unconditionally. In their eyes, she wasn't a failed cleaning lady or an aging woman in over her head. She was their fortress, their constant, their home. And that knowledge gave her strength to face another day of other people's pity and her own relentless determination to prove them wrong. Margaret's body had begun betraying her in ways that couldn't be ignored with determination alone. Her hands, once steady enough to guide chalk across blackboards with elegant precision, now trembled as she attempted to thread needles for her evening alteration work. The persistent cough that had started as a whisper now demanded attention with sharp, rattling demands that left her breathless and dizzy. Dr. Morrison at the community clinic had been blunt during her last visit, his kind eyes unable to soften the harsh reality of her test results. "Margaret, you're pushing yourself beyond human limits." The anemia is severe, your blood pressure is dangerously high, and these chest x-rays show shadows that concern me deeply. You need rest, proper nutrition and follow-up care that I know you can't afford." She'd nodded politely, pocketed the prescription she couldn't fill, and walked home planning how to hide her increasing weakness from 7 pairs of watchful eyes. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who had spent decades teaching children to speak up for themselves, had become expert at silent suffering. Each morning brought new challenges. Stairs that seemed steeper, cleaning supplies that felt heavier, and a fatigue so profound that she'd catch herself dozing while standing. But the children's needs remained constant, urgent, unforgiving of her. Body's rebellion against years of sacrifice. Jennifer had begun watching her with the sharp awareness of someone forced to mature too quickly. "Grandma Maggie, you're breathing funny again." She'd observe her teenage voice, carrying worry that belonged to adults. Margaret would wave dismissively, manufacturing smiles that felt increasingly hollow. "Just tired, sweetheart. Nothing a good. Night's sleep won't cure." But Jennifer's eyes held knowledge that couldn't be fooled by grandmother's protective lies. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday morning in November, disguised as an ordinary moment. Margaret was hanging laundry. In their small backyard, each clothespin requiring monumental effort as her vision blurred and her chest compressed with increasing pressure. The last thing she remembered was reaching for one of Emma's tiny dresses, thinking how proud she was that the 4-year-old had learned to dress herself before the world tilted sideways and darkness claimed her consciousness. Jennifer found her, crumpled among the wet clothes, her weathered face grey against the November frost. 7 children surrounded their fallen fortress with terror-stricken faces, unsure how to exist in a world where Grandma Maggie could fall. The ambulance ride became a blur of sirens and small hands clutching each other, while strangers asked questions none of them could answer about insurance and emergency contacts. At Chicago General Hospital, Margaret drifted between consciousness and dreams filled with classroom memories and children's laughter. When she finally opened her eyes, Jennifer sat beside her bed with red-rimmed eyes and a manila envelope that made Margaret's heart stop. "Grandma Maggie," Jennifer whispered, "I had to get important papers from under your mattress for the doctors. I found these." The secrets Margaret had guarded for 5 years lay exposed in her granddaughter's trembling hands. Teaching certificates, award letters, newspaper clippings celebrating her educational achievements, and most devastating of all, the letter offering her the principal position at Washington Academy, dated exactly 5 years ago. Jennifer's voice broke as she read aloud, "Dear Miss Sullivan, your innovative teaching methods and dedication to underprivileged students make you the ideal candidate for our prestigious academy. The board unanimously agrees that your appointment as principal would elevate our institution's commitment to educational excellence." Margaret watched her granddaughter's face transform as understanding dawned. Their cleaning lady grandmother had once been an accomplished educator who had walked away from prestige and financial security to raise 7 abandoned children. The hospital room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors measuring a heart that had finally been forced to reveal its deepest secrets. Margaret reached for Jennifer's hand, her voice hoarse with years of unspoken truth. "I couldn't let them separate you. I couldn't let the system decide you weren't worth keeping together. You were worth more than any job, any recognition, any future I might have had." Jennifer's tears fell onto the yellowed certificates as she finally understood the magnitude of sacrifice disguised as simple grandmother's love. The revelation changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Margaret was still the woman who woke before dawn to pack lunches and stayed awake past midnight mending clothes. But now Jennifer understood that each meal prepared and each homework session supervised represented choices made by someone who had voluntarily abandoned a career dedicated to shaping young minds so she could focus on shaping 7 specific souls who had needed her most. Word of Margaret's collapse and hidden history spread through their neighborhood with the speed of shocking truth. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store arrived with bags of food, tears streaming down her face as she apologized for years of judgmental glances. "I didn't know," she whispered to Jennifer. "I thought she was just... I'm so sorry." The community that had whispered criticism behind Margaret's back now mobilized with fierce protectiveness, organizing meal trains and childcare assistance while she recovered. Former students began appearing at the hospital after Jennifer's desperate social media post seeking help with medical bills. Dr. Patricia Williams, now head of pediatrics at Northwestern Memorial, knelt beside Margaret's bed with tears in her eyes. "Miss Sullivan, you taught me that education wasn't about memorizing facts, but about believing in possibilities. I became a doctor because you convinced a poor girl from the South Side that intelligence had nothing to do with zip codes." One by one they came, lawyers, teachers, business owners, social workers, all carrying stories of how Margaret Sullivan had changed their trajectories before she disappeared to change 7 more. The Chicago Tribune picked up the story, running a front-page feature titled, "The Teacher Who Chose Love Over Legacy." Donations poured in from strangers moved by the narrative of sacrifice disguised as simple love. A GoFundMe campaign organized by Margaret's former colleague exceeded its goal within hours. But the most profound gift came when the principal of Washington Academy arrived with an extraordinary proposition. They wanted to create the Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship, one for children aging out of foster care, ensuring that her legacy of educational advocacy would continue, even though she had chosen a different path. As Margaret sat in her hospital bed, surrounded by evidence of lives she had touched both in classrooms and living rooms, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace with her choices. The certificates and awards had been meaningful, but they paled beside Jennifer's tears of understanding and the sight of 6 younger children who still called her Grandma Maggie with complete trust in her ability to make everything right. Recovery brought new challenges wrapped in unexpected gifts. Margaret's body remained fragile, requiring medications she could now afford and rest that had become possible through community support. But more significantly, her secret had been transformed, from burden into bridge, connecting her past achievements with present love, in ways that honored both the teacher she had been and the grandmother she had chosen to become. The children processed their grandmother's revelation with the resilience of those who had learned early that love came in many forms. David, still struggling with reading, approached her bedside with new understanding. "Grandma Maggie, were you really a teacher? Could you help me read better now that I know?" His question carried no accusation, only hope that perhaps his struggles might be met with professional expertise, wrapped in unconditional love. Margaret's response came from a place deeper than career credentials or educational theory. "Sweetheart, I've been teaching you every day how to be kind when others are cruel, how to persist when things are difficult, how to take care of each other when the world feels scary. Reading is just one more lesson we'll master together." She realized that her most important curriculum had never been written in any lesson plan, but had been lived daily in their cramped apartment, where 7 children learned that family could be chosen and love could triumph over circumstance. The transformation in their lives wasn't just financial, though the relief of having groceries and heat was profound. More significantly, Margaret found herself able to blend her educational expertise with grandmother's wisdom in ways that had been impossible when survival consumed all her energy. Homework time became less frantic struggle and more guided discovery as she applied decades of teaching experience to helping each child find their unique learning style and celebrate their individual strengths. Jennifer blossomed under the newfound respect that came with understanding her grandmother's sacrifice. No longer did she carry the weight of family survival alone. Instead, she became Margaret's partner in creating educational opportunities for her younger siblings. Together, they established learning stations throughout their apartment, transforming their cramped space into a laboratory for curiosity and growth that honored both Margaret's professional expertise and her unconditional love. The community that had once whispered behind Margaret's back now celebrated her as a local hero, but she remained focused on the 7 reasons she had made her choice. Each evening as they gathered around their kitchen table, now sturdy thanks to donations, for homework and stories, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had chosen correctly. These children were not just her responsibility, they were her masterpiece, living proof that love could be both teacher and lesson, both sacrifice and reward. Recognition brought opportunities Margaret had never imagined possible. The University of Chicago offered her an honorary doctorate in education, acknowledging both her classroom achievements and her real-world application of educational principles. Standing at the podium in her borrowed dress, surrounded by 7 children who'd been granted front-row seats, Margaret spoke not about pedagogy or curriculum development, but about the most important lesson she had learned, that teaching wasn't confined to classrooms, and the most significant education happened when someone loved you enough to believe in your potential, even when you couldn't see it yourself. But the moment that crystallized everything came on a quiet Sunday evening, when 10-year-old Michael, who had struggled most with anger about his parents' abandonment, climbed into Margaret's lap as she rocked in the chair the children had bought her with pooled allowance money and community donations. "Grandma Maggie," he whispered, "I'm glad you picked us instead of that fancy job. We needed you more than those other kids did." His simple words captured the essence of Margaret's choice. Not a sacrifice that diminished her, but a decision that had multiplied love beyond any measure she could have achieved in traditional success. The following months brought stability Margaret had forgotten was possible. Medical care transformed her persistent cough into manageable condition. Proper nutrition returned color to her cheeks and strength to her hands. But most importantly, the removal of financial desperation allowed her to focus on what she did best, nurturing potential and celebrating small victories that led to larger transformations. David's reading improved dramatically when Margaret applied specialized techniques she had learned for dyslexic students decades earlier. Jennifer enrolled in college preparatory courses, her brilliant mind finally receiving the academic challenge it craved. Emma, now 5, began showing artistic talents that Margaret nurtured with supplies donated by grateful former students. Each child's growth represented validation of Margaret's belief that love combined with expertise could overcome almost any obstacle. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund grew beyond its founder's wildest expectations, eventually supporting hundreds of foster children pursuing higher education. But Margaret found her greatest pride in watching Jennifer mentor younger children in their neighborhood, passing forward the lessons about resilience and hope that had been learned around their kitchen table. The cycle of education and empowerment continued, proving that Margaret's true legacy wasn't measured in certificates or awards, but in the lives that continued touching other lives in ever-expanding circles of influence. As winter melted into spring, Margaret established new rhythms that honored both her past profession and present calling. Morning still began with breakfast preparation, but now it included gentle tutoring sessions tailored to each child's needs. Afternoons brought volunteer work at the local elementary school, where she applied her expertise to help other struggling students while earning modest income that supplemented their improved financial situation. Evenings became sacred time when Margaret would gather her 7 children around her rocking chair and share stories, sometimes from literature, sometimes from her teaching career, but most often about ordinary people who chose extraordinary love when faced with impossible circumstances. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were lessons disguised as comfort, teaching her children that heroism often looked like showing up every day for people who needed you most. The neighborhood children began gravitating toward their apartment, drawn by Margaret's reputation as someone who could make difficult concepts understandable and boring subjects interesting. Soon their kitchen table hosted an informal tutoring center where Margaret's professional skills served families who couldn't afford private help. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had returned to teaching, but on her own terms, in a space filled with love rather than institutional pressure. Jennifer's graduation as valedictorian of her high school class became a community celebration, with former colleagues, grateful students and neighbors filling the auditorium to honor both the young woman's achievements and the grandmother who had made them possible. When Jennifer delivered her speech, she spoke directly to Margaret. "My grandmother taught me that education isn't about collecting credentials, but about using knowledge to lift others. She showed me that sometimes the most important teaching happens, not in classrooms, but around kitchen tables, where someone believes in you enough to stay up past their bedtime, helping you understand fractions or friendship or forgiveness." As Margaret sat in the audience, surrounded by 6 other children who beamed with pride at their sister's achievements, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from witnessing dreams becoming reality. Jennifer's scholarship to Northwestern University represented not just one girl's success, but validation of Margaret's belief that consistent love and high expectations could overcome almost any disadvantage. The teacher in her recognized excellent instruction bearing fruit. The grandmother in her simply felt overwhelming pride in a child who had exceeded every hope. The evening after graduation, Margaret found herself alone on their small porch, rocking in her chair as city sounds provided familiar symphony. The 5 years since she had collapsed in the backyard felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. Her body remained fragile, her future uncertain, but her choices had been vindicated in ways she never could have imagined when she first opened her door to 7 frightened children who needed someone to believe in their worth. Dr. Williams visited regularly now, not as Margaret's physician, but as her friend, often bringing her own children to experience the warmth of a home where education and affection intertwined seamlessly. "Miss Sullivan," she said during one such visit, "you taught me to see beyond circumstances to potential, but I never understood the full impact until I watched you raise these children. You didn't just change their lives, you changed how they'll change other lives. That's the real measure of teaching." Margaret's response came from a place of deep contentment. "I thought I was giving up my career to save my grandchildren. I didn't realize I was actually expanding my classroom to include everyone whose life they would eventually touch. Sometimes the most important lessons can't be planned, they have to be lived." As she spoke, she watched Michael teaching neighborhood children how to fix bicycles, passing forward the mechanical skills he had learned from necessity and the patient instruction methods he had absorbed from years of receiving Margaret's gentle guidance. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund continued growing, eventually establishing a permanent endowment that would support foster children pursuing education for generations. But Margaret's proudest moment came when the scholarship recipients began mentoring younger children, creating an ever-expanding network of support that honored the principle she had lived daily, that education was most powerful when it was shared with love, patience, and unwavering belief in human potential. As Chicago's summer heat settled over their neighborhood, Margaret established what would become her lasting tradition. Every Sunday evening, she would gather not just her 7 children, but any neighborhood child who wanted to join for story time. On their front steps, these gatherings became legendary in their community, drawing children from blocks away to hear stories that somehow always connected literature to life lessons, academic concepts to practical wisdom and individual struggles, to universal truths about resilience and hope. One particular evening, as twilight painted their street in soft gold, Margaret found herself surrounded by 23 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16. She had been reading from Charlotte's Web, but the discussion had evolved into deeper territory as her young audience grappled with themes of friendship, sacrifice, and the ways love could transcend even death. 8-year-old Maria, who struggled with her parents' recent divorce, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Margaret, do you think Charlotte was stupid for dying to save Wilbur? My mom says sacrificing for others is stupid because people don't appreciate it." Margaret paused, recognizing the pain behind the question, and chose her words with the careful precision of someone who understood that her answer would shape not just Maria's perspective, but the worldview of 23 impressionable hearts. Maria's sweetheart Charlotte didn't die because she was stupid. She died because she understood something very important, that love isn't about getting appreciation back. It's about making sure the people you care about have the best chance possible at a good life. Sometimes that means giving up things that seem important to you so something more important can happen for them. Margaret's voice carried the weight of personal experience, and several older children exchanged glances that suggested they understood she was speaking about more than fictional spiders. Jennifer, now preparing for her sophomore year at Northwestern, had joined the circle during her summer break. She listened to her grandmother's words with the deeper understanding that came from knowing Margaret's full story. "Grandma Maggie," she interjected gently, "isn't it also true that sometimes what looks like sacrifice actually turns out to be the most meaningful thing you ever do? Like how Charlotte's Web lasted longer than Charlotte did." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of recognition and pride. Her oldest granddaughter had grasped the deeper truth, that Margaret's choice to leave teaching hadn't diminished her impact, but had multiplied it in ways traditional education never could have achieved. These 7 children, now thriving young people, would carry forward lessons about resilience, compassion, and unconditional love to hundreds of others throughout their lives. The web of influence would expand, infinitely touching lives Margaret would never meet, but had already helped shape. As the evening deepened and children began heading home to their own families, Margaret remained on her front steps with her original 7, now ranging from 9-year-old Emma to 18-year-old Jennifer. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about how far they had traveled from those desperate early days when survival had consumed all their energy and hope had seemed like an unaffordable luxury. David, now 13 and reading at grade level thanks to specialized techniques Margaret had applied with infinite patience, broke the silence with a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Grandma Maggie, do you ever regret not being a principal? Would your life have been better if you had taken that job instead of keeping us?" His voice carried the vulnerability of someone old enough to understand the magnitude of sacrifice, but too young to fully comprehend its true rewards. Margaret pulled him closer, breathing in the scent of his hair that still smelled faintly of the coconut oil she used to tame his cowlicks each morning. "David, let me tell you something about better. I thought I wanted to be important, to have my name on office doors and my picture in newspapers. But importance isn't about titles or recognition. It's about knowing that your life mattered to people who needed you most. You 7 children are my greatest accomplishment, not because of what you achieve, but because of who you've become and who you'll help others become." Michael, now 15 and accepting his first job at the local community center, teaching younger children basic repair skills nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned to transform his own early anger into productive mentorship. "And we wouldn't be who we are without you, Grandma Maggie. Not just because you kept us together, but because you showed us that family isn't about blood or money or perfect circumstances. It's about showing up every day and believing in each other even when everyone else gives up." Emma, the youngest at 9, but possessing an artist's sensitivity that allowed her to perceive emotional truths beyond her years, climbed into Margaret's lap as darkness settled over their neighborhood. "Grandma Maggie, I want to be a teacher like you when I grow up, but I want to teach art to kids who think they're not good at anything, like you taught us we were good at everything." Her innocent declaration carried profound understanding of Margaret's core belief that education at its best wasn't about imparting knowledge, but about helping people discover their own inherent worth and unique gifts. Margaret's response came from a place of deep contentment and renewed purpose. "Emma, sweetheart, you're already teaching. Every time you share your art supplies with other children, every time you encourage someone who's struggling, every time you show kindness to someone others ignore, you're teaching the most important lessons of all. The classroom is just one place where teaching happens. The world is full of opportunities to help others learn and grow." As Chicago's skyline twinkled in the distance, Margaret Sullivan, former teacher, eternal educator, chosen mother and beloved grandmother, rocked gently in her chair, surrounded by 7 young people whose lives stood as testament to the transformative power of unconditional love, combined with unwavering faith in human potential. The certificates and awards that had once defined her professional identity now seemed less important than the living legacy gathered around her on this ordinary summer evening that felt extraordinary in its quiet perfection. The scholarship, but bearing her name, would eventually help thousands of foster children pursue higher education. The tutoring program that had grown from their kitchen table would expand into a neighborhood institution. The stories shared on their front steps would be retold by children who became adults, who shared them with their own children. But none of these external measures captured the true magnitude of Margaret's choice to prioritize love over prestige, family over career advancement, and present need over future security. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Jennifer lingered on the steps beside her grandmother. "You know what I realized today," she said softly. "You didn't give up being a teacher when you chose us. You just changed your classroom and specialized in teaching the most important subject of all, how to love people through impossible circumstances. Every one of us is going to spend our lives teaching that lesson to others, whether we're in actual classrooms or not." Margaret squeezed her granddaughter's hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from Jennifer's summer job at the community garden, where she taught inner-city children about growing food and growing hope simultaneously. "Jennifer, you understand. Something that took me 68 years to learn. Teaching isn't a profession. It's a calling that can be answered anywhere, anytime, with anyone who needs to learn that they matter. You've been my best student and my greatest teacher all at the same time." As they stood to go inside, Margaret took one last look at their neighborhood. The same streets that had once seemed like a trap now appeared like a launching pad where 7 young lives were preparing to spread lessons of resilience, compassion, and possibility throughout the world. Her sacrifice had been transformed into multiplication, her loss into legacy, her choice into countless choices that would ripple forward through generations of lives touched by children who had learned that love was both powerful enough to overcome any obstacle and simple enough to be expressed through daily acts of showing up, believing in each other, and refusing to give up on people who needed someone to fight for their potential. The house that had once felt too small for their dreams now seemed perfectly sized for the foundation they had built together. A foundation strong enough to support not just 7 individual futures, but a network of influence that would expand, far beyond anything Margaret could have achieved in traditional success. As she turned off the porch light and prepared for sleep, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had chosen correctly, loved completely, and built something that would outlast her own life by generations. Have you ever experienced or know someone who has experienced having to make a difficult choice between personal dreams and family responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the end, Margaret Sullivan's story became more than just a tale of personal sacrifice. It became a testament to the way love multiplies when it's given freely, how teaching extends far beyond classroom walls, and how the most important legacies are written not in official records, but in the hearts of people who learn that they are worthy of unconditional love and capable of extraordinary things. Her 7 children grew into adults who carried forward her lessons in their own unique ways. Jennifer became a social worker specializing in family preservation. David opened a literacy center for struggling readers. Michael established a non-profit, teaching job skills to at-risk youth, and Emma founded an art therapy program for children in foster care. The 3 younger ones continued their education with the confidence that comes from knowing someone believes absolutely in their potential, carrying forward Margaret's conviction that every child deserves someone willing to fight for their dreams. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund eventually endowed a permanent center for educational support services, but the true memorial to her life could be found in the countless moments when her former grandchildren and the countless people they influenced chose compassion over convenience, persistence over giving up, and love over fear. Years later, when Margaret was in her 70s and her health had stabilized enough for her to enjoy watching great-grandchildren play in the same backyard where she had once collapsed, she would often reflect on the unexpected mathematics of sacrifice. She had given up one career to save 7 children, but those 7 children had become teachers, social workers, counselors, and advocates who would touch thousands of lives. The multiplication was infinite, immeasurable, and more beautiful than any lesson plan she had ever created. On her 75th birthday, the entire neighborhood gathered for a celebration that had grown far beyond anything Margaret could have imagined. Former students who had become doctors, lawyers, and teachers mingled with foster children who had received scholarships, community members whose children had benefited from her front step story sessions, and 3 generations of her own family who called her not just grandmother, but hero. Dr. Williams, now director of Chicago's Department of Child Services, stood to address the crowd gathered in the community center that had been renamed in Margaret's honor. When I was 12 years old and failing everything, Miss Sullivan told me that intelligence wasn't about having the right answers. It was about asking the right questions and never giving up on finding solutions. Today, I want to ask the right question about Margaret Sullivan. How do you measure a life well lived? The answer came not from any single voice, but from the collective presence of everyone gathered. Former students who had learned to believe in themselves, grandchildren who had learned that family could be chosen, and fought for neighborhood children who had discovered that stories could change their understanding of what was possible, and community members who had witnessed how one person's choice to prioritize love over prestige could transform an entire neighborhood's understanding of what mattered most. As the evening wound down and Margaret found herself once again surrounded by her original 7, now adults with children and careers and dreams of their own, she felt the deep peace that comes from knowing that every difficult choice had led to this moment of profound connection and purpose. Jennifer, now married and expecting her first child, sat beside her grandmother with tears in her eyes. "Grandma Maggie, I hope I can love my children the way you loved us, completely without conditions and with absolute faith that they can become anything they dream of becoming." Margaret's response came from a place of complete contentment. Jennifer, you already know how to love that way. You learned it around our kitchen table in our tiny bedrooms during those years when we had nothing but each other, and somehow that was everything. Love isn't something you have to learn. It's something you have to choose again and again, especially when it's difficult. As Margaret looked around at the faces of people whose lives had been touched by her choice to prioritize love over personal ambition, she realized that her true education had begun not in college classrooms, but in the moment she decided that 7 frightened children mattered more than her career trajectory. The years of sacrifice had taught her lessons no textbook could contain about resilience, faith, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people who refused to give up on each other. The community center began to empty as families headed home, but Margaret lingered with her 7 children, now adults but still her babies, sharing the comfortable silence that comes from complete understanding and unconditional love. Outside, Chicago's skyline glittered with promise, but inside this room, filled with people who had learned that family could be chosen and dreams could be rebuilt. After devastating loss, the real illumination came from connections that would last generations. As they prepared to leave, Emma, now a successful art therapist whose work with traumatized children had gained national recognition, approached her grandmother with a framed drawing. It showed their old apartment building, but rendered in bright colors, with flowers growing from every window and children playing safely in the courtyard. At the bottom, in Emma's careful handwriting, were the words, "Home is where someone loves you enough to stay." Margaret smiled as she studied the drawing, remembering the scared little girl who had once hidden her artistic talents because she believed she wasn't good enough to create beauty. "Emma, this is perfect. It shows exactly what we built together. Not just a place to live, but a place where people could grow into who they were meant to become." The drive home through familiar neighborhoods felt like a victory lap through choices well made and love well invested. Margaret had begun this journey as a woman who defined herself by professional achievements and external recognition. She was ending it as someone who understood that the most important teaching happened not in classrooms, but in moments of daily choosing to believe in people when they couldn't believe in themselves. The scholarship fund would continue growing. The community programs would expand, and the influence of 7 children who had learned that they were worthy of fierce love would ripple outward through generations. But as Margaret Sullivan settled into her rocking chair on this perfect evening, surrounded by evidence of love, multiplied beyond any measure she could have achieved through traditional success, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing she had answered life's most important question correctly. When faced with a choice between personal advancement and human need, she had chosen love. And love had chosen to multiply beyond her wildest dreams. Congratulations, type 7 in the comments. So I know you stayed with me until the end. Leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. See you.